and this gets into these debates about teleology, and like I see this in the trans debate all the time, where I think a lot of the trans activists have like a very radical, non-teleological perspective of the universe, such that there's no ultimate point to anything. So like the evolutionary process is just totally blind. It's non-normative. It doesn't have any purpose or meaning or anything. It's just like, so we're just like these fleshly bodies made out of atoms, and there's no rhyme or reason or teleology or like normative logic or purpose in that. So therefore, this leads to like transhumanism. And I saw you had a video on transhumanism.
Yeah,
But
I'm a transhumanist myself, but I also like to think from a teleological perspective as well. So I have to
Interesting.
disagree with you that like teleology can lead to that, because in my case it was teleology that led to that.
Interesting. I'm very curious. What would be like, for example, just I don't know, to
Sure.
give an example, like with bodily integrity identity disorder, it's like not wanting your leg. You're just like born, you like don't want your leg, and so like I think on the teleology account, you're like, having a leg is like normative because your purpose as a human being, you're like designed to walk in two legs. That's part of our like natural normal thing. Whereas like I think on the more transhumanist account, or at least like the non teleological accounts, like, well, if you want to modify your body, there's nothing like disordered about that, so as long as it satisfies your like desires to some extent. So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious how you connect these two things, because
Okay. So here are some of my thoughts. Well, I don't think transhumanism can be reduced to just like one simple thing or one way of thinking, because it really is just like an umbrella of different ideologies. So what I'm thinking personally may not apply to some other transhumanists, especially hedonistic transhumanists, which I often find myself at odds with. But no, I don't think it's necessarily just about satisfying certain need, and I don't think anyone should be cutting off their legs if people who feel like they should be doing that need help. But what I mean about transhumanism and teleology is that we have been born with an impulse to overcome our nature, both internal and external. And we have been sort of, if you analyze human history and the development of technology, we have always sort of tried to attempt to improve our condition, right? Like the state of humanity, the condition of humanity. And we have made many successful and less successful attempts at that throughout history. So I think of it from a very cosmic perspective, right? Like I believe in like Heraclean concept of logos in Arche. Like there is a universal principle that is like the fundamental law of the universe, and I think that the whole cosmic evolution operates on such principles. So cosmic evolution to me is both like the development of energy density and reduction of radiation, and complexity in nature, but I think it also extends to humanity. When we think of cosmic, we a lot of the time think of something very, very external, far out there, but we are part of the cosmos, right? And we are operating on those same principles, and there is a telos, a purpose to us, just like everything else in the universe, because it operates on such principles. And I think the fact that everything in this universe evolves, and I also like to think that this sort of evolution accelerates, something we have definitely observed. And I think it accelerates even more when it gets isolated into bubbles, like energy density has evolved much more on, let's say, Earth than in space. So think it is our purpose to continue on with that sort of evolution, and we have the potentiality to improve our condition. And I think it's well, it is our purpose to do that, but I also think there is something much more to that. It's something very, very cosmic to technological evolution. And a lot of people fear it, right? Because there is this fear like it's beyond our control. And, you know, in a way, of course it is. I like to compare technology to fire. And I also think fire was a very early form of technology, really. And fire actually helped us already improve our body. Like if we think of the early example of transhumanism, it's the use of fire, because once we started to cook meat and eat cooked meat, this allowed us to process the food in our body in a much more efficient way, which allowed the energy to focus on the organ development, which allowed us to develop the brains we have today. That is hitting the limitations of humanity in our biology. I think of that as transhumanism, and I think there should be a purpose to the steps we are taking to exceed such limitations.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I like agree with you that sort of like cultural technology is like baked into the nature of humanity. So in that sense, like our telos is to be cultural technological creatures. I do think you're right about that, but I'm kind of curious, like I've gotten into arguments with like trans activists about this recently, about, for example, the question of puberty blockers. And, you know, the teleologist wants to say that a person born male ought to go through male puberty because that is natural and normal and healthy, whereas I think the trans activist who's sort of like against any idea of teleology is resistant to that idea that we ought to go through male puberty if we are born male, because they say like, well, you know, there's nothing normative about going through puberty, like your natural puberty, because that's natural puberty, but natural doesn't mean good, and there's no inherent purpose. So like, so there's no intrinsic goodness about going through your natural puberty. So therefore, puberty blockers, the interruption of that puberty, that natural puberty, it's like there's nothing wrong with that because there's no telos there. So I'm curious, like how your thoughts on that claim about puberty and that being like something we ought to do. Whereas I feel like the more transhumanist idea is like, well, you know, maybe puberty is something that we were constrained by in our past, but now that we have all these technologies and drugs to interrupt puberty, if we want to do that as part of our cultural, technological evolution as a species, now we can like disrupt our puberties and like, you know, delay our puberties or interfere with this, do this and that. We kind of like, you know, in that sense, like the idea that puberty is like healthy and normal, kind of like they don't like that because that implies that the default state of like not doing anything and letting you go through puberty is like preferable than like the not. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you are sort of reducing transhumanism to one specific thing. So when it comes to puberty alone, I'm sort of in the middle there. Like I think if we had the possibility to, well, can we really like overcome the limitations of our bodies when it comes to puberty? I think of it more as an illusion of cheating the system. Like, well, okay, sure, you can cheat your mind and body that you're not going through puberty, but that will have negative effects on you, right? Like, I think it is healthy to go through your natural puberty, and yeah, sure, you can technically replace it with puberty blockers and then artificial hormones, but you're also medicating from a very young age, and we know just how much HRT, how unhealthy it can be to take it for a pretty long period of time. And if you're taking it from a very, very young age, well, it's not the best thing. And, trans activists a lot of the time, they like to say that, puberty blockers are dangerous only if you take them for a very long time without going on HRT. But I also see this argument as an excuse to start hormonal treatment as quickly as possible. So I think of it as a big lie that puberty blockers are there to give it more time to think it through. It's an illusion. I'm not buying into that. But I think there are many issues with human puberty that we are developing during that. I think if we could overcome the discomfort of puberty, that is something I would like to see technology and medicine doing in the future. Just making the process of puberty more smooth and less uncomfortable for the individual than it already is. That is something I would absolutely be for, but otherwise, no, I don't really subscribe to this ideology that we should fully control puberty as such.
Yeah.
And I also think that the development of sexuality in an individual is also very important. And a lot of the time I find that if someone develops their sexuality, they might also change their mind about transitioning through that. They might actually accept themselves as gay if they develop that attraction. But if you give a child puberty blockers and you do not allow them to develop that attraction, you're taking that opportunity away from them at that point. But is there a telos? Is there a purpose to puberty? Of course, I think there is a physical purpose to that, right? Like to mature. But on a subjective level, however, I'm not sure whether puberty in and of itself has a purpose in that sense. Sort of like, has aging subjective purpose to me? Not really. I think of it more as, well, something that is just happening to my body. It's beyond my control, but it is not my purpose to age. And a question I like to ask myself is, like, if we think of purpose as that which is natural, well, human beings are dying. Is it our purpose to die, or is dying something that sort of stands in the way of us achieving our purpose? Because, well, it's very rare that you see someone say, oh, my purpose in life, I want to die, unless you are suicidal, which I don't think is a good thing. But I think that death is sort of a limitation of human purpose and human potential. And, well, when people are dying, the next generation, right, we are sort of building on the fundamentals of the ideas of people who came before us. But what's the generations before us built, right? Most of it crumbles down after their death. All the knowledge and wisdom they gained throughout their life, all we have left of that is perhaps what they wrote down, and that's a very, very small part of it, and we build down on that. So I think that the world without dying would actually see more progress and further steps into achieving our true purpose. I don't think we can actually fully understand our real purpose as long as we are dying.
Do you think there is like a single purpose, or what is that something we can find out or figure out? Because like, what would that be? Like how would we know that we've like correctly identified like the purpose? Because typically, like, this is where the people who are fans of teleology, they like appeal to some authoritative religious text in order to ground the teleology. Otherwise, it just becomes subject to human whim and human subjectivity. And so they say, like, well, without some rootedness and like an objective telos that's like absolute, then we're just going to descend into some sort of like, I don't know, like a very like yeah, they just think it'll descend into like nihilistic hedonism or something.
Well, no, I think it's a genuine, justified concern that it may evolve as such. But regarding whether there is some, I like to call it final purpose, like final purpose of a certain substance. So a lot of the time, I like to ask myself: is there such a thing as a final purpose to humanity? Is there such a thing as final purpose of technology, or is it more like a constant stream of movement either in one direction or perhaps different potential directions? And I personally like to think that there are different potential directions, right? And if there are different potential directions, well, they might lead somewhere, but which of those would be the actual final purpose? I think that the idea of final purpose is actually captured in concepts such as nirvana or eudaimonia.
Right. Do you feel like the concept of transhumanism is like there's like a riskiness there insofar as it like can lead to some of the negative aspects of the gender ideological movement, such as there's this one, I'm thinking of this one really famous transgender activist who's a transhumanist. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, Martine Rothblatt. I think she's like some billionaire like transhumanist who has done all this work trying to like upload her consciousness to like the like digital world. And she has this idea that male and female in terms of the sexual dimorphism is like an outdated relic of our past, and like through technology we can sort of like overcome that distinction. And she's like, yeah, like labeling male or female on our birth certificates is going to be just as outdated as like in apartheid South Africa, labeling on your birth certificate whether you're like white or black. And eventually we're going to move beyond the limitations of the male-female sexual dimorphism, and like we'll have like artificial wombs and like artificial insemination, and like the idea that like our sex is determinative to some degree, or that we're like constrained by our reproductive capabilities, when like we're just gonna like augment through technology our bodies so radically and like completely destroy the like traditional distinction between like females are the ones that gives birth, whereas now it's like it'll be the machines that give birth, and like the fact that we're male or female will be like irrelevant or something. We're gonna like evolve past that limitation of male and female, which and then people like connect this to the gender movement. It's like, well, see, this male female stuff, it's just a social construction, it's just a limitation, we're gonna move past it, like, and it's kind of you can see how that like plays into like some of the trans ideological stuff, which is that the identity trumps everything.
You mentioned quite many things for me to address. First, where you mentioned about like uploading your mind to a computer, or transferring your mind from the physical to digital. It's actually a specific type of transhumanism that concerns itself with that. It's called posthumanism. And what posthumanism entails is that, well, we are no longer humans at that point. And that is something I just don't find particularly appealing, and I don't think it's the best solution, really. Well, we do not really understand the nature of consciousness completely, right? It is still a big subject of discussion and study, even both neuroscience and philosophy of mind, right? So can you make a copy of consciousness and transfer that? Well, I think if you do that, that's no longer you, right? You are giving an AI your own property while erasing yourself. I think it's a sure way to just erase humanity at that point and give all the power to the machines, to artificial intelligence. Like that's no longer you. I don't really subscribe to that sort of thinking at all. But what you also said about transhumanism and trans ideology, I think there's definitely an overlap there. And a lot of the time I think of our achievements in trans healthcare as a type of transhumanism, right? Like, well, yes, it is something that helps you overcome your biological limitations, right? If you can transition medically. Uh, and I also think it will give someone more autonomy over their body. And I absolutely think we should have more autonomy over our bodies than what we have right now. Like, I think, there are cases where someone has a specific type of sexuality they do not wish to have, and some of that sexuality can be harmful, right? And there are harmful types of sexuality. I'm not going to say it here because you know how YouTube is. It often kills videos that use this type of terminology, but it starts with P. PED.
Right.
Rhymes with torpedo.
Yeah.
Like, if someone could have the autonomy to change their sexuality through technological and medical means, I think it could be beneficial for many individuals, and I think it will allow us to have more control over our lives, which I think will also allow people to live more fulfilled lives that are in true with themselves. I think that there can be a certain gap between you yourself as an individual, what you want, and what your body, what your sexuality, what your genes want, right? And I think if we can provide autonomy for that, to give the individual more power over their own body, I see that as absolutely positive.
And going back to this idea, I thought it was interesting, this idea you mentioned about like a technological cure for a maladaptive sexual orientation, and I think about this in the context of like autogynephilia. Like, if there was a pill to cure autogynephilia, like, would I take it? That's a question. Because clearly the AGPs who go the escalation path, go the indulgence path, like, they're getting pleasure out of it. Like, it feels good to go down that pathway. And so I think a lot of people, like, even though their autogynephilia is a source of a great amount of distress psychologically, because it basically gives them this fantasy that's impossible to fulfill, such that gap between your fantasy and like the reality of embodying that fantasy, there's always going to be a gap, which leads to dissatisfaction. But at the same time, there's so much like euphoria. It's almost like a drug addiction. It's like the high you get from indulging in that is so high that I think, like, even if like a young AGP like walked into like a clinic or something and said like, hey, I have these feelings, and then the doctor's like, well, we can give you this pill and you won't have these desires anymore. Like, it'll relieve this distress that you have from not embodying the desires, but at the same time, you'll never feel the pleasure of satisfying those desires. And I think a lot of AGPs would actually not take the pill. They would take it because the pleasure from the escalation is so great that they like. So yeah, I don't know. It's sort of like this interesting question, like whether AGP is like natural variation or it's like somehow a pathological deviation from normal heterosexuality that ideally we would not want to allow to exist in the gene pool. But then you get into questions like, now we're talking about eugenics and all this stuff. So it's like,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you brought an important point there that why a lot of people wouldn't do that because they will deprive themselves of that pleasure. But I'm thinking, okay, and of course, we're speaking a purely hypothetical scenario here, but let's say you take this sort of pill that erases your AGP, your autogynephilia, wouldn't then some other desire that was already there be intensified because it now took the main stage and you'd likely still be satisfied sexually. It's just that the source of that satisfaction would sort of change right now, like something else that was maybe in the background was overshadowed by autogynephilia will not be the primary drive of your sexuality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting philosophically because like because that alternative desire is not present in your consciousness, you're not aware of what it would be like to go down that alternative pathway. Whereas like you're confident that you can derive pleasure from the fulfillment of your AGP desires, but like you just don't have like insight. It's like kind of like an other minds problem. You just like can't put yourself in the shoes of your future self who would have a different desire. So you can't like know that like that would bring a happiness that is comparable because maybe the satisfaction of this alternative desire doesn't feel as good as the satisfaction of like your AGP desire. So, but I do think a lot of like trans activists, even though they liked to, talk about gender dysphoria as like a medical condition, I think there's this big push to depathologize that because there's this fear that the scientists are going to somehow find a cure for gender dysphoria, which would lead to a decreased incidence of transgender people in the population, which they equate to like cultural genocide of some kind or another, which is analogous to like the deaf community. Even though a lot of people sort of like commonsensically think of like deafness as like a disability, a lot of people in the deaf community feel like, no, it's not a disability. It's like an enhancement with this new cultural apparatus of like sign language and our deaf culture, our deaf community. It's like actually a good thing so long as we're like accommodated and we have our own language. I feel like trans is like the same exact debate, whereas like people think it's like trans culture is like inherently good. So if you cure gender dysphoria, you would get rid of trans culture, which would be a bad thing, which would have a net negative on our society because trans culture, even if it's associated with these like negative medical, pathologies, it's like ultimately like a net positive because of how trans culture like, contributes to our society, giving us like unique perspective on things or something like this. So I don't know. I think it's like a very deep philosophical area, but I don't really have any clear answers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, it's definitely like a ethical problem we're facing here, right? I mean, sure, on one side you would absolutely erase a certain culture, but on the upside, well, gender dysphoria is causing suffering in individuals. There are individuals who are experiencing either mild, moderate, or severe form of suffering because of their gender dysphoria. So if you were to cure that, you will also reduce the amount of suffering in the world and unnecessary suffering, because I like to differentiate between unnecessary suffering and what I consider more essential suffering. I think we need some degree of suffering in our lives to challenge us. Yeah, should that be done? I mean, let's say as an autistic individual, right? There's been a lot of talk in the past about curing autism, but like most autistic individuals do not wish to be cured. I myself, I don't really want to be cured from autism, right? That's almost sounds like the majority of people forcing the minority into becoming just like them, into like conforming to the standard. So I definitely wouldn't say no to a pill, to a medicine that would potentially cure my autism. But will there be someone who would be willing to take that pill? I think yes, absolutely, right? So now, well, the question is, should my opinion on this and my reason not to take that pill also limit someone's right to take that pill if they wish to? Well, I don't think so, and I have a very individualistic, libertarian, anarchist approach to most things, right? Like the way what I want to do with myself and my body, the way I want to live my life, shouldn't inflict limitations on others what they want to do. I mean, to certain reasonable degrees, right? I think we can all agree that there should be some limitations there, as long as it comes to things that cause harm to others. So, no, I mean, the way I see it, if such medicine would be created, I think it should be available, but not necessarily forced. So, again, it creates more autonomy for the individual. What would you like to do with your gender dysphoria? Do you want to transition, or do you want to take this pill that will cure your gender dysphoria?
Right.
And I think there will be, people who will choose either or.
Right. I do think it's interesting. I agree with that analysis for adults. I think the tricky part is when we get to the children who are not capable intellectually
Yeah.
of making these decisions about their own autonomy. So it's like, but a lot of the trans activists, they want to frame these questions. You have a child experiencing distress about their sex body or their sexual or gender expectations or something about this. And the trans activists want to frame this in terms of not primarily an issue of like a pathological disease that's causing distress, but a problem of self-actualization such that we're giving a treatment in order to help them actualize their autonomous desires. But my problem with this is the assumption that the expressed wishes of a 12-year-old are an indication of their authentic self
Yeah.
that they are trying to actualize at that age, as opposed to what's more likely going on, given the statistics about desistance and stuff, is that they're dealing with typical struggles that they're likely going to grow out of. So it's like I think that's the danger in some of these like autonomy approaches that I agree with intellectually for rational adults, but like the question is like, okay, well, we can use the age 18 as an arbitrary legal boundary for demarcating this stuff, but ultimately, from a cognitive science perspective, it's like that 18. That's like a legal arbitrary thing. So it's like, how do we, in like a principled way, like determine whether like someone's expression is like a matter of their authentic autonomy, or given the likelihood of these social contagion hypotheses, that it's not actually authentic? And what does it mean to be an authentic, self-authenticating autonomous desire when like our desires are influenced by like the cultures and the surroundings and like things like internalized homophobia or autism or trauma or misogyny and all these things, or like social media trends or TikTok, blah blah blah. Like, so it's like it's hard to really figure out like, how do we detect an authentic desire versus a desire that's not authentic? That's kind of like the $1 million question.
But you also said that you are an autogynephile. Could you say more a bit about your experience, what it was like growing up with autogynephilia, and whether it is something you realized from the start, or if it is a conclusion you arrived at later on?
Sure. So when I was very young, it all started with like a fascination with like hosiery. So, I would like steal like my mother's like stockings that she would like discard in like the trash or something. I was just like really drawn to like the texture. So something about like the sensory texture was intriguing to me as a young boy. And prior to puberty, it didn't necessarily have an explicitly erotic component, but there's a sort of like fascination and intrigue. And yeah, I was just like really fascinated by that aspect of clothing. And then from there, you know, with like puberty, it kind of like, you know, it got combined with like masturbation habits and sort of like more explicitly erotic feelings. And then from there, it just sort of like slowly snowballed such that I became, you know, interested in not just hosiery, but like, you know, all aspects of feminine clothing, and sort of just becoming, you know, like wanting to wear, you know, feminine clothing. And that developed like a paraphilic dimensions such that it was like a specific erotic fixation on a particular external object, like a piece of clothing or something. And then from there, you know, in like high school, when I got on the internet, I discovered, you know, pornography, and I discovered transgender pornography. And then, you know, that developed into sort of like this thing where there's this thing called GAMP, gynoandromorphophilia, which is essentially a specific sexual interest in like the she-male body, like the chick and the chick with the dick, basically. that specific body type. That became like something I was like sexually interested in. And then there's a sort of like autosexual component of that, such that you're watching that form of pornography and you're identifying with the transsexual, such that you're attracted to that person, but you want to be that person. You want to embody that thing. So, whereas for me, like the more classical case of autogynephilia is you're attracted to the female form, like, and you want to embody that female form, like, you know, like you want a vagina, for example. But for me, because my autogynephilia was focused on the transsexual body, and the desire to embody that transsexual body, that's probably why I never really developed bottom dysphoria. I never really developed, you know, dysphoria about like my penis or anything, because my idealized embodiment was that she-male body type. And so then, you know, I spent my 20s, you know, cross-dressing and going through, you know, your classic AGP binge purge cycles, where I was like, you know, dating women and trying to be this masculine guy and like, you know, be like the heterosexual guy. And I was like largely successful as a heterosexual male. Like I never had really much trouble dating women. But nevertheless, you know, I got married when I was in my early 20s. And she knew I was like a cross-dresser, but and she knew I cross-dressed. I didn't like hide that from her, but it was always something I kind of did in the privacy when she was like out of the house. I kind of had like my secret stash of like girl clothes that I would like put on and have like a masturbation session or something. And then, you know, for complicated reasons, we got divorced, not necessarily related to gender issues. It was, you know, it's a longer story. I won't get into that, but she left. And then from there, I was like 28. And I was like, suddenly I was in grad school. I didn't have any family responsibilities, didn't have any job or anything, or I was in grad school. So I felt like it was an environment that would facilitate gender exploration. So I basically was like, it's like, wow, like now I have this opportunity to cross-dress to my heart's wish. And so, you know, in the classic AGP, as you start to engage in it all the time, such that it goes from the occasional masturbation session to something, now you're wearing women's clothing every day, and then eventually, you know, it sort of takes on this progressive nature, such that I like wanted to come out publicly as a crossdresser. So I came out on Facebook as a crossdresser. And then like a month later, I came out as trans, because I kind of realized that like living a social life and having a career as a cross-dressing male who goes by like a male persona, he, him, with a male name, there's not really like a good narrative model for that in our society. And I felt at the time, and this was in 2015 during the trans tipping point, Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner is on the news. And I was talking to a therapist at the time about my cross-dressing, and she planted this idea. It's like, oh, like your story reminds me of Caitlyn Jenner. You should watch this interview. And so I watched, Jenner's interview, and I was like, oh, wow, I relate to that life story, classic AGP, lifelong history of cross-dressing and hiding cross-dressing. And then, so I sort of got this narrative that like the concept of trans woman was like the acceptable narrative for me to live out and embody my desire for cross-dressing. And then from there, and because I wanted to cross-dress, I sort of developed this like internal conflict in my mind, because I was also, as a male, I was really into like bodybuilding and weightlifting and stuff. And so like this desire to be the masculine, jacked, bodybuilding guy was sort of in conflict with my desire to be a waifish, feminine crossdresser who wanted to maximize my femininity. And that was sort of my first taste of like dysmorphia about my body. As I started disliking my muscularity, because it was in conflict with my desire to embody a more feminine, like a more feminine archetype. And then once I started my social transition, I was initially like, well, I'm gonna try and live this duality. I'll sort of like cross-dress in my social life, but like at work, in my family, like my parents, I'll be a guy. And then that didn't last very long, and I eventually realized I needed to develop like a more integrated social persona as like a trans woman, or to develop, like a successful social life. And so, in order to do that, I needed to pass better, because being like some clocky, cross-dressing male with like beard shadow and like be muscular and manly, I just didn't want people to be staring at me all the time and discriminating against me and pointing at me and laughing at me and being a laughingstock and being seen as like a disgusting, perverted crossdresser. So I started developing a desire to, okay, well, now I'm going to get my laser on my beard. I had like 11 rounds of laser, and then I got on the hormones. And once it was like once I started that social transition pathway, that was when a lot of my dysmorphia and dislike of my maleness really sort of ramped up, such that I like eventually developed more classical gender dysphoria. But it all came out of that original autogynephilic impulse from transvestic fetishistic arousal associated with like wearing women's clothing. So like that's kind of like my story. And I still have autogynephilia. I still struggle with these desires and how to handle them. And then also, now that I'm back on testosterone, since I got off the hormones, like my sex drive and like my libido is like much more dominant in my mind, because once I got on the hormones and I transitioned, I was wearing this clothing all the time. It just became normalized, and sort of the erotic impulse goes away eventually, or it's significantly diminished, such that when you're living this life as a trans woman, as an AGP trans woman, you get habituated to the stimulus, and it's no longer taboo in your mind because it's become a public acceptable thing. And arousal is primarily driven by like things like novelty and taboo and shame. And so like when you fully transition, you eliminate the novelty because you're doing it all the time. You're habituated to the stimulus. It's not kinky or taboo anymore. So the erotic element faded, and it just got replaced with just like this sort of like it wasn't erotic. It was just like
ordinary.
It was just like ordinary contentedness. And so like a lot of people think that if you're AGP and you transition, you're just walking around with a boner all the time. And it's like, And it might be true for some AGPs who are still highly sexual as trans women, which is why a lot of AGPs who transition, they get into sex work and OnlyFans, and they get into, so they sort of like fetishize themselves because there's a huge market for this content. And that becomes like a source of living for a lot of people. They become like, cam girls and all these things, and that's sort of like how they make their money. So yeah, that like connection between like the pornography and the fetishization. So I wouldn't say that an AGP just becomes like this completely non-sexual being post-transition, but it's sort of like you don't like necessarily get aroused in the same way by putting on your normal clothes. You just go to work and you live your life. You're watching Netflix on the couch, eating popcorn. You're not like aroused during that state, even though you're cross-dressed. Sorry, that was like a long long rant there.
I appreciate it. I think you had an interesting story to tell and a very interesting take on the subject. So, no, it's appreciated. Just talk as much as you want. It's sort of interesting for me to hear of that, because I have sort of a very, very different experience with transition, right? I never felt particularly aroused by female clothing, of the idea of people seeing me as a female or a woman, but there is one part that I sort of related to, and that is when you talked about the idea, or like this obsession of not just being attracted to a woman, but becoming one. So when I was a teenager, when I developed this idea that I wasn't good enough as a man, and the only way for me to fit in as a society was as a heterosexual woman, I got a bit obsessed with like observing women, because I had to say, okay, I have to become like one in order for nobody to just perceive me as a guy cosplaying as a woman, right? So you are also like developing this obsession of becoming a certain woman, and might not have been attracted to one, but I was still like looking at a lot of women and noticing like the details and in behavior and things like that, like small details in mannerism, and just trying to adopt that in order to fit into this completely new role for me. And I remember just how weird it felt wearing like women's clothing for the first time. I did it in a full day after I was 1 month on estrogen. Felt really, really unnatural, but I sort of like convinced myself that this is something I'm going to get used to, right? So it's a very different experience, but when it comes to things like stalkings, I can sort of understand the arousal associated with that, because I do think there is something definitely very erotic about that. And actually the only instances during the time I lived as a trans woman when I was stalking, so was basically when my boyfriend wanted me to do that. Like he bought me some of those as a birthday present. Well, I think that that was a birthday gift for him, like not for me necessarily. But would you say that AGP starts as a sexual phenomenon, but as it develops, it becomes less so? Because that is my impression of what you just said, that as it goes through the stages of its development, it sort of loses that sexuality. Then that's why a lot of trans women would say that they are not AGPs because they are no longer experiencing that, but that it's common to experience that so-called euphoria boner at first.
Right. Yeah, no, I think for your transsexual AGPs who've transitioned and are on hormones, and the hormones are, lowering their libido and removing that like libidinous element that comes from testosterone, the erotic element fades away and gets replaced by a more romantic orientation. So if we use the metaphor of AGP as a sort of like form of heterosexual attraction, in a normal heterosexual attraction, when you first start dating a woman, like you might get very aroused by that, but then, if you marry her 30 years later, you look at your wife and you don't get like an instant boner necessarily. You just sort of, but you're still in love with her. There's that romantic attachment. That's like a good metaphor that the people use for autogynephilia, except like rather than like dating and falling in love with someone else, you sort of date and fall in love with like your own idealized self-conception of yourself as a woman. You fall in love with the image of yourself as a woman, which is why it's very common in the early stages of transition for AGPs to obsessively take selfies and photographs, to obsessively stare at themselves admiringly in the mirror. And they're sort of like, I can't believe how hot I am now. They're sort of like really attracted to themselves. And a lot of people want to say that, well, if you survey natal females, they also show this like looking in the mirror and thinking they're hot. But I think this is a distinctive phenomenon from how it manifests in AGP males, because that eroticized self-attraction is the dominant sexuality, whereas in the case of the females who just look in the mirror and think they're hot, like they don't develop their entire sexuality around that, and usually it is in the context of getting ready for a date, such that it's connected to your imagining being sexy for someone else. And I just don't think it's, and also that context with the natal female, it's applicable to, explicitly getting super sexy, like putting on special lingerie, doing your makeup really nice. Whereas for the AGP, it's in the context of these extraordinarily mundane things, like, shaving your legs, or, waxing your eyebrows, or, like things that are so normalized and mundane that they don't trigger like that, like arousal in like a female, obviously. But with the AGP, it becomes sort of like eroticized and paraphilic insofar as it's sort of eroticizing things that are like are totally normal. So for example, you can be AGP and have physiological AGP such that you get aroused at the idea of like menstruation, whereas like I don't really think females are getting aroused at the idea of menstruating. So like,
No, exactly.
so it's taking normal female situations and then eroticizing them, and that becomes like the basis of like your sexuality. So I think there's just like a fundamental distinction there. And also those surveys that they gave those natal females to prove that they have AGP or AGP-like things, the questions that they ask were not quite identical to the questions asked in males, which for the male sexuality, it's more internally focused, and it's not really dependent on the context of like preparing for a date or getting ready for a date, or whatever. It's sort of like obligatory in your own mind, so that you can't even climax without engaging in these fantasies. Whereas like for the female, like their regular sexuality is not defined by this autosexual attraction. It's just like an incidental side effect of just like normal like self-esteem, essentially. So it's like confusing self-esteem at finding yourself hot versus having your entire erotic sexuality driven from this this internalized attraction. So they're two distinct phenomena, but they kind of like possibly like share a superficial similarity, which is why trans activists who are AGP like to think that, oh, I just have normal female sexuality, but it's like, no, it's like not the same at all. And it's like, it's one of the most persistent myths out there that people try and use to discredit the theory of autogynephilia, which is to say that, oh, you're only biased against these trans women because you're saying like, they're different from cis women. Whereas if like a cis woman did this, you wouldn't think it's like deviant or whatever. It's like, no, like, and that just depends on this gender identity theory that says that because they have this gender identity that they're identical to females, they just are born in the wrong body, and their body is like their testosterone is like tricking them into having like these euphoria boners. And it's like the cis women, the females, if they had testosterone, then they'd also show the same phenomenon. But like, I don't know. I think it's complicated. But Phil Illey has done good work, and also researchers in the field like Michael Bailey have done more sophisticated surveys asking the question like how truly autogynephilic are natal females compared to trans women. And if you like have a correct like measurement scale for that, and you compare it across natal females and trans women are way more autogynephilic, which is to be expected because male sexuality is different than female sexuality. And it's only this gender confused erasure of innate sexual differences that makes people think that somehow male sexuality is like equivalent to female sexuality, but they're not. Even though I do think that a small minority of females can experience something analogous to autogynephilia, but in the reverse direction. But it's not like the same. It's like similar or analogous. So, but it's definitely not like typical female sexuality either.
Well, it always seems to me like this type of sexuality that autogynephilia is almost feels like a romanticization of the ordinary.
Yes.
Like commonly associated activities, I guess, that could be considered feminist, just cleaning, which I really don't think it should be. I don't think it really is a feminine thing. I think it's a purely cultural thing while we associate that with femininity. But if you're like aroused by that, you are romanticizing something completely ordinary. Right. Or like you mentioned something like period or breastfeeding. It is like just ordinary things for a woman or a mother. But yeah, romanticizing that. I don't think it's just sexualizing things. I think it is a romanticization of the phenomenon. And you also said that a lot of the time people like to say that female sexuality works just like a sexuality of an AGP trans woman, and I sort of agree with you that there is this difference in male and female sexuality, but a lot of the time I hear people arguing that as you transition, as you're an estrogen, your sexuality is sort of developing more into female sexuality, and I think there is definitely some truth to that. I experienced it myself, right? But I think it's sort of like you said, right? Like how it is developing from something purely erotic to more ordinary as your transition progresses. But I think the difference is primarily in the source. That like you started as a AGP with male sexuality. Well, the thing is, most women, when they hit puberty, they don't start as AGPs with male sexuality. And you might think that, well, it's a small difference because now my sexuality is just like that of a female. But no, it's not really the case, because that origin, the source from which it came from, has a lot to say for your development
Right.
as a person, right?
Right. Yeah, because it's that origin, the fact that the AGP starts off in a male body, and then all their fantasies revolve around the transformation into a female. That transformation element, the fact that you want to transform from a male to a female, is key to the erotic fantasy itself. Whereas the female who is looking in the mirror in their sexy lingerie and thinking, wow, I'm hot, they're not imagining a transformation into the other sex. So that is like the key difference, is that element of transformation. And often if you look at sissy hypnosis pornography, that transformation element, called sissification or feminization, it's the transformation element itself that gets fetishized often. It's not always the case. I think in the more cases where you have a purely more anatomical oriented autogynephilia, you might not explicitly fantasize about that transformation element, but I have heard cases of people with anatomic autogynephilia sort of be on like a Reddit for like trans bottom surgery or whatever, and like getting like aroused at looking at these trans women's surgical outcomes, which I think is like a similar sort of thing as like a fantasy about that transformation process. So I think that's the key difference between the female who just thinks they're hot versus like the male who's fantasizing about this transformation, is that it is a transformation of the body that becomes integrated into the erotic fantasy, which is why you see so much of the sissy hypnosis centered around the eroticization of that transformation process, such that things like taking HRT and taking, that becomes part of the fantasy itself, such that, you take the HRT and that becomes erotic because it's transforming you. So you sort of like, you enjoy the thought of that transformation process. So I think that's like the key difference.
I've been thinking a lot about like the etymological origin of the word autogynephilia, and do you think that someone who's a autogynephile also has to be autosexual, in the sense that they have to be attracted to themselves, or either sexually or romantically, sort of? Like, is it actually a form of autosexuality, or do you consider it a completely separate phenomenon?
I think they're related, but not exactly the same connotation. It's more like the technical term that is theorized is a erotic target identity inversion. So you have your typical erotic target to femininity that's out there, but then that target that is normally external becomes internal, such that you now have an attraction to what you're attracted to in the world, but now you're attracted to the thing being in your own embodiment. So it's not that you're attracted to like yourself, but you're attracted to the embodiment of your erotic target, which is femininity. So you're attracted to yourself being feminine. So it's slightly different than just being like, oh, I'm in love with myself, but it's like you experience arousal at the thought of embodying the thing that you're attracted to, which is femininity. So it's slightly different, but it's autosexual insofar as its sexuality related to something internal. So it's like an internalized attraction. So it's maybe that's like a subtle distinction, but it's
Well, a lot of the time I like to think of it as like there are two subsets of autosexuality, and the standard one that we like to think of is obviously the homosexual type of autosexuality. Like, well, if you're attracted to yourself, like obviously you have to be gay because you're attracted to the characteristics of your own sex, right? But sometimes I think of autogynephilia and androphilia as really like form of a heterosexual autosexuality. And I also sometimes think that if that lack of self-attraction, if the presence of self-attraction is not really there, should we really be considering it as autogynephilia or autoandrophilia, or should we actually provide a different term to explain the phenomenon? Because like I'm not denying the existence of phenomenon, but I don't always like the term autogynephilia or autoandrophilia. I think we maybe should replace it with something else.
I do like Phil Illy's vocabulary that he's developed, that he frames it in terms of auto-heterosexuality, which is inclusive of both autoandrophilia and autogynephilia. And he thinks like the core phenomenon is a inversion or partial inversion of heterosexuality. So that's, and I think that's a pretty like conceptually coherent distinction, though sexologists disagree whether autoandrophilia is like an actual thing because they're skeptical that females can have paraphilias. But I think Phil has done enough preliminary evidence gathering and to show that there's like a reality to that phenomenon, even if it's not like perfectly analogous, because like male sexuality is different than female sexuality, so it doesn't manifest with the same fetishistic intensity that I think like male sexuality does. I don't think it's quite has that level of like compulsion and rigidity that is a characteristic of like a male paraphilia gone out of control, which I think is like unique to like the testosterone driven male sexuality.
Blanchard wrote about like the 4 different subtypes of autogynephilia, right? Like being transvestic, behavioral, anatomical, and physiological. And a lot of the time, I like to think that only anatomical and physiological autogynephilia can actually be classified as true autogynephilia. That not all like cross-gender arousal necessarily falls under that category. So like a purely behavioral and transvestic autogynephilia wouldn't actually be autogynephilia. I think that this sort of cross-dressing arousal is often, and in most, maybe in all cases, a component of autogynephilia, but I think there's much more to it than that. I think of it as a part of the whole, if you think of autogynephilia as, in more holistic terms. But I don't think that arousal associated with cross-dressing in and of itself necessarily can be classified as a case of AGP.
I would disagree with you there.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
But I think a lot of these things are like interrelated. So, for example, if you have behavioral autogynephilia, such that you have a desire to be treated like a woman, particularly sexually. Okay, well, you have this desire to be treated like a woman sexually. Well, that's going to be influential on your anatomical autogynephilia, because maybe now you want a vagina to be, you like want the man to treat you like like a heterosexual woman. So the behavioral autogynephilia can imply the anatomic and vice versa. So I think even though Blanchard sort of like deconstructed this into the distinct categories, I think it's very rare to have pure forms of these things. They're, like most AGPs have a combination, and starting off with one can lead into others. So for example, if you have transvestic AGP, that can lead to a desire to socially pass, which is behavioral AGP. And that desire to behaviorally pass can now want you to, maybe you want to get laser hair removal in order to facilitate your transvestism. So now you have anatomical, because your sexual characteristics of your beard is technically part of your secondary sexual characteristics, which is part of the anatomy. So like, is a transvestic AGP who gets laser in order to pass better so that they can facilitate their female impersonation, because I think a lot of people don't, they think of like the like transvestite is like it's only just clothes only, but it's like it's female impersonation. That's what it is. It's like it's not just wearing like a feminine shirt. It's like it's like female impersonation. So there's a difference between just being like, you know, a little bit feminine as a guy, and like maybe you like wear a woman's shirt, maybe you have a woman's jeans, but that's different from transvestic AGP, which is more like female impersonator, basically. So like, and that female impersonation is like you might wear breast forms as part of your transvestic cross-dressing. So it's sort of like related to anatomical, because you're sort of you're attracted to the female embodiment wearing the breast forms, but it's like, is your desire for that female impersonation so strong that you want to get the hormones so that you don't have to wear the breast form? So these things are all like interrelated. I don't think you can so cleanly carve them off, because the one usually influences the other and leads to the other. So I think it's almost artificial to carve them up into these distinct things, because they're so interrelated and they lead to these interrelated desires.
Yeah, but do you think they can exist in and of themselves separately? Like, for instance, someone who just gets aroused by wearing women's clothing, but without the, let's say, behavioral, anatomical, and physiological aspect.
I do think it's possible. Yeah, I think there are cases like that. But for your typical transsexual AGP, because not all AGPs are, you know, go on to transition, but the ones that do, I think, you know, you usually have some combination of all these things. And usually it is the more purely paraphilic or fetishistic ones that are only the transvestic. But typically, if you start off with transvestism, it will escalate into the other forms. So it's like, yes, it starts off with transvestism, but now you have an interest in having sex with a man while you're dressed up in your transvestism. So that's now behavioral, because you want to be treated like a sissy by some alpha guy or whatever. So now it's behavioral. So it's, these things are all like, you know, it's hard to like tease it apart, because typically, and also paraphilias cluster. So typically if you have, I think it'd be rare for someone to just, you know, have a completely isolated thing that's like so narrowly focused that doesn't eventually escalate.
Do you think AGPs are unfairly demonized as predators in society?
I think it's complicated, because there are absolutely many predators and bad apples, and yeah, and like you just go to like Redux magazine, you'll see like endless stories of AGPs behaving badly, and, you know, being fetishistic and paraphilic and like disturbing and like blah blah blah. And it's sort of like unsettling and disturbing to see people's paraphilias, you know, kind of like on display so prominently. But I do think they are unfairly characterized because the vast majority of AGPs are fairly regular people who aren't, like a risk to society or whatever. But the problem is the sort of transgender ideology has made it such that if you're just a regular AGP, you don't really have too much of a deviant personality, or you're not like, at risk of like a harmful escalation of like paraphilia that involves like, like harming children or like assaulting people or like exposing yourself or engaging in these sort of like, this like exhibitionism and stuff, like the transgender ideology will say like, no, I'm going to encourage you to use the female changing room because you really are a woman, and you have this gender identity, and so therefore you're a woman, and therefore it's like it's bigotry for you to not, play in the women's sports team and stuff. So I think like the ideological activism has sort of like enabled AGPs to act in socially maladaptive ways, even though from like a personality perspective, they might be gentle souls who wouldn't harm anyone and who have no ill wishes against anyone and are just trying to like live their lives as normal people and fit into society. And usually these are like often like nerdy autistic people. So yeah, I do think it's unfairly demonized as just being total depravity and perversion run amok, and like, they're all narcissists and they're all pathological and they're all, personality disorders and blah, blah, blah. I think like most AGPs don't have personality disorders and they're not like raging pathological narcissists, but I think the culture of transgenderism is enabling bad behavior through this seductive idea that, well, if you identify as a trans woman, that means you are 100% just the same as any other woman and are thereby socially entitled to these things. So I think that the transgenderism as an ideology breeds entitlement, and that entitlement leads to maladaptive social behavior that is, violating the sanctity of these female single-sex spaces. When ordinarily, I think if we had a different social arrangement, like we could accommodate AGP in a way that wasn't so socially maladaptive. And because most AGPs are just regular people who happen to have this like unique sort of sexuality to them that causes them to develop these feelings and transition, etc. So I do think I think there's definitely an element of truth to the demonization, because it's just absolutely the truth that there are some like really bad apples out there. And also a lot of AGPs are creepy and fetishistic and have male entitlement and male socialization, and they sort of like look and act and feel like males. But whereas there's other AGPs who, pass really well and are normal and well adjusted and, just want to get along, and they're not in denial of reality. They're just trying to like live their lives. So I think it's like a complicated thing, which is why I'm trying to bring more nuance to the conversation.
Right. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. It was really lovely having you over here. A total pleasure. Probably one of the, if not the most interesting conversation I had on this channel, actually. So really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. This is great. I really loved our philosophical conversations. I don't have this very often, so it's really nice. So, okay.
Yeah. I hope you have a good day, Ray.
Yep.
And thank you for watching, everyone. And go check out Ray's channel. I'll leave the link to his channel in the description down below. Have a good day, everyone.